listen, you can hear their hearts beating loud. Can't keep those California Indians down.
Hello, everyone. You're listening to American Indian Airwaves. For Marcus Lopez, I'm your host, Larry Smith.
Wounded Knee wasn't like other demonstrations that were going on.
The ones for jobs or fair housing, those were the civil rights protesters. They wanted to be equal, to be treated like everyone else. They were fighting to get into the system. We were different. We wanted out of the system.
Today on American Indian Airwaves, the 50th anniversary of the occupation of Wounded Knee from February 27th to May 8th of 1973, a 71-day military standoff between members of the American Indian Movement, Native Americans, and the U.S. government. We'll speak with Kevin McKernan, director of the film From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, a reporter's journey about his rookie NPR experiences on his first assignment in covering the occupation of Wounded Knee. You're listening to American Indian Airwaves.
When the moon shines bright, the lone fool in the black of the night, you can hear the whisper in the valley. And you know when Kamakani blows to the Bahu drum, it's the warriors who are marching down the mountain. Because history ain't no mystery to me.
2023 marks the 50th anniversary of the occupation of Wounded Knee from February 27th to May 8th. It is the outcome of over 200 members of the American Indian Movement and supporters occupying Wounded Knee in the Lakota Nation, or South Dakota, in response to a call to action from traditional Lakota residents whose civil, human, and treaty rights were constantly being violated by corrupt Indigenous government officials and the United States government. The Wounded Knee occupation resulted in a 71-day military standoff with government officials, the FBI, and quickly drew international and domestic support from people, organizations, and foreign governments throughout the world. Today on American Indian Airwaves, Marcus Lopez, executive producer of American Indian Airwaves, and myself have the honor and pleasure to speak with Kevin McKernan, who's director of the documentary From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, a reporter's journey. He was a rookie NPR reporter, and his first assignment was covering the armed occupation of Wounded Knee in South Dakota in 1973. He has the honor and pleasure to join us here on American Indian Airwaves in this two-part interview, which we begin with asking him how he arrived at Wounded Knee in 1973.
Well, I was a supposedly educated college graduate who knew nothing about the Native side of American history. I was in St. Paul, Minneapolis, and there are many reservations in Minnesota, and I was totally unaware of them, totally unaware of treaties. I had never been to South Dakota, never been on an Indian reservation. I certainly had never seen anyone shot or killed, as I was about to during that very long 10-week takeover of the village, the historic village of Wounded Knee. So it was all, I was a rookie, very green and wet behind the ears, and really doing my first major assignment, for which I was terribly ill-equipped. So I was kind of a blank slate, a tabula rasa in a lot of ways, awfully threatened by the big names, the reporters who came from Washington and New York and actually from other countries to cover this one-of-a-kind resistance. And I just was learning the trade, I guess. and that brought me to some startling observations. I think it's fair to say that 71-day occupation is the greatest resurgence, greatest revival of Native resistance since the 1800s. It was just an extraordinary experience for all who were there, and especially for a non-Indian like myself, who was there without other reporters after the government gag order banning reporters from covering the resistance from the inside. And so I had to find a way to get in there once the FBI sealed off, and they had hundreds of agents, hundreds of other agents with the U.S. Marshals Service, U.S. Border Patrol, dogs, sheriff's deputies. It was kind of a magnet for law enforcement because no one had seen anything like this in their lifetimes, and they wanted to snuff it out. And so they had a cordon around Wounded Knee, which was, an area with pine-studded hills and gullies, and a place that most people would not go because there was nothing there in terms of so-called civilization. And so I had to find a way to penetrate this cordon around Wounded Knee. And I was able to do so after the media ban only by going to a neighboring reservation about 80 or 90 miles away, the Rosebud Sioux Reservation, where a medicine man and his family had lived for generations. And his name was Henry and his son Leonard Crow Dog. And they were the keepers of the flame, you might say. They had kept tradition and language alive the first years of their lives. They didn't know any English, and they inhabited a place called Crow Dog's Paradise, which I found out accidentally getting gas in the tribal headquarters village of Pine Ridge, across from the tribal headquarters building. The man who pumped my gas, do you remember when they used to do that? They used to pump gas. And he it turned out, was a part-time medicine man. And, we talked for about a half an hour after I got the gas, and I told him what I needed and couldn't do, and how I couldn't just drive down the road into Wounded Knee. We had been able to do that. Accredited journalists were allowed to come in and go out during the daytime prior to that. So I'd been inside Wounded Knee, but now that it was sealed, I couldn't do that. And this man at the gas station told me about Crow Dog's Paradise on the neighboring Rosebud Reservation. And he said that's the staging ground for guns and ammunition and smuggling and everything. It's all being directed from there. And so I made my way there and kind of did a stakeout outside on the road at Crow Dog's Paradise, which invited some of these young teenagers with rifles to offer at one point to castrate me. And that didn't happen. In fact, the senior medicine man, Henry Crow Dog, came out and gave them a short lecture saying the spirit does not know what color this man is. And so eventually, that kind of eased the tension, and I continued to camp in my car. At one point I was allowed to go in and meet the leaders of the American Indian movement, who were not in Wounded Knee but coordinating things from the outside. And what they were coordinating was the smuggling of the material that I've just mentioned, and people as well. And they were sending a lot of people with supplies in on horseback. But recently, there had been many arrests, and there was some discussion about whether that high profile in the woods was the way to go. But in any case, they operated a kind of underground railroad on the reservation. So when I received their permission to go in, the rest was set up for me, and I didn't know where I was. When I was asked to lie down on the floorboards in the back seat of a '64 Chevrolet, and a woman named Irma Two Bears, who was sitting in the passenger seat, who was about 7 or 8 months pregnant, and a driver who was part of this Underground Railroad, not her husband, at the wheel of the car. I just remember his name was Bert. And so they took me from Crow Dog's Paradise and onto the Pine Ridge Reservation, some 70, 80 miles away. And I stayed one night there in someone's home, sleeping on the pile carpet in front of the Johnny Carson show. You're probably not old enough to remember that, Marcus, or are you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, it was a strange thing for me, because here I was in a stranger's house, and I was trying to go to sleep because I knew I had a big day the next day, and there were a lot of Indians in the room, and they were all laughing at Johnny Carson. And I kept saying to myself, don't they know how important Wounded Knee is? How can they be doing this? How can they be laughing now? Of course, it was just another night, you know. And so the next morning, Bert, the driver I mentioned, and Irma Two Bears showed up in their '64 Chevrolet, and back I went on the floorboards of the back seat, and away they went on a series of dirt roads for, I would think it would be more than 40 miles. It was a bumpy ride, and they were watching for Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA police cars. And at one point, one of them turned around on the road to give chase because he smelled something that was off, I guess, or he was just harassing these people. And they took off, and they were able to lose him in a stretch called the Gooseneck, where the dirt road makes these great big series of turns. In any case, long story short, we arrived in the village of Manderson, which is maybe 8 or 9 miles from Wounded Knee. And there I was brought to a safe house of traditionalists, Lakota speakers, and asked to wait in the backyard, which was an Indian junkyard with lots and lots of cars. And so I sat in one of those cars during the daytime until it got dark. And then some older men, probably above 50 or 60, they seemed really ancient to me, came out, and they told me they built a fire, and they had what I learned was called a sweat lodge, and I knew nothing about that. And they asked me to come into the sweat lodge with them to take off my clothes, and there was some snow on the ground and everything, and I did so. I just remember that they had sagging skin. They seemed so old, and of course they were younger than I am now. And so I was invited into the sweat lodge, and here I experienced strangers praying for my safety. And it was an unusual experience because it gave me some idea that I was heading into some risky territory. And then when they finished the sweat lodge, and they were praying in the Lakota language, they invited me into this a log cabin which had no electricity, and just an ice box and a stove there, and lots of little kids, on mattresses that had just been placed on the floorboards, and they were eating government commodities. They used to have these tubs from the Department of Agriculture that were dumped on the reservation, and they're spreading peanut butter and jelly on Wonder Bread. I wonder if you're old enough to remember Wonder Bread, Marcus.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, as you know, Wonder Bread was not a wonder. It was terrible. It was like a sponge, And in any case, so I watched all this, and dimly lit with lanterns, and then the men were speaking Lakota at a table, and they gave me something to eat, some soup and some coffee, and talked about how they had an Indian guide who would come from the other end of the reservation named Chips, and he would be the one who would take me in. They thought it was it would be faster of course, by horseback, but I would present a bigger target.
And you're listening to American Indian Airwaves. We're speaking with Kevin McKernan, director of the documentary From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, a reporter's journey about him as a rookie NPR reporter on his first assignment covering the armed occupation of Wounded Knee in South Dakota in 1973. And now back to the interview.
The FBI and the marshals were using tripwires, which they had strung around the entire perimeter of the village. These were the same tripwires they were using at that time against the Viet Cong. And little did I know that the Pentagon was illegally supplying federal agents with the know-how and the equipment and the weapons to fight this paramilitary operation they were engaged in. And it was secret because the Nixon administration did not want to disclose that there was a national emergency. Nixon considered himself a friend of Native people since he had a Native football coach at a Quaker university here in California and had been mentored by him. And so this man who was to be disgraced at Watergate and did a lot of things that I personally didn't agree with, had actually done more for the reclamation of native land and other things than any other president before him. But in any case, he did not want the embarrassment of doing this, of the United States military operating against its own citizens, which would have been fine and authorized by law if he had simply announced a national emergency. But he wanted to keep it secret. So that was the reason the military was there. And later, hundreds of cases against Indians were thrown out because of this violation. It's a violation of a statute called the Posse Comitatus statute, which was supposedly designed to keep America, the U.S., from becoming a banana republic where the military operates freely against its own people. Well, in this case, this was going on, and that disclosure, that revelation afterwards was a scandal, and it led to the dismissal of all these cases. But if you just back up a little bit to that night when I'm sitting around the table, these guys were saying, well, can a Washichu walk that far? A Washichu is Lakota for a white person. The actual translation is Washichu is the taker of the fat. And I didn't know how far it was that they were talking about. In fact, I couldn't understand most of what they were saying. They were only using some English here or there. And it was decided at the end that the safest way to get a reporter in there, and they were very interested in having a reporter because the leadership at Wounded Knee was very worried that once the press was out of there, there could be a second massacre. And of course, the notorious first massacre had taken place some 83 years earlier in 1890. And so here on this sacrosanct land where so much blood had been spilled, some 200 or 300 civilians running from 5,000 combat troops that had been dispatched by the White House in that year to stamp out their religion, the ghost dance. More about that if you want later, but back to the story of my getting in there. So I thought, well, gee whiz, here I am. I better put on my reporter's hat and ask some devil's advocate questions of these guys, or I'm never going to be a reporter. So I said to them, and they understood, mostly understood English, and I said to them, well, what do you think of this ragtag band called the American Indian Movement? These urban Indians who come down from another state, Minnesota, and come onto your reservation, aren't they causing trouble down here and division and so on? I'll never forget this old man who said to me in Lakota accented English, I was American Indian Movement 1920. So that gave me a pretty good idea that this was something that had some deep roots, and it wasn't something that really was born in the 1960s. In fact, there were years and so many years of broken treaties and abuses and poverty and police brutality and so many things there that for, almost 100 years, and this storm had been building and building as I would finally become educated and know myself. And the American Indian Movement aim was just the thunderbolt that blew open the storm, but it had been building for such a long time. So we set off at night, maybe about 8 o'clock, and Arthur Chips taking me through the woods, and on my journey up and down what they call in South Dakota draws, which are just canyons and ditches and that sort of thing. And of course, we did hit one of those tripwires, the kind that the military was using against the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. And what happened then, I think it was I who tripped over this tripwire and released these flares that lit the area up above us, just like noontime. And that brought out the federal agents in their jeeps, and they got so close to us we could hear them talking, and they had begun to make a lot of arrests of smugglers going in with food and guns and ammunition and medicine and all that, and they were achieving some degree of success. So, but lucky for us, they did not get us, and we saw them and heard them, but they finally drove away. And we were much more careful not to trip a trip flare after that. So at some point, maybe it was 5 o'clock in the morning or something, it was very close to dawn, Arthur Chips, my guide, and I were looking down on some lights in what looked like a village. And so Chips said rather proudly, finally, Wounded Knee. And then he said,
that is an incredible story, Kevin. And once you got there, what did you do?
Well, I just tell you this part where my Indian guide tells me that's Wounded Knee, and then he stops for a minute. He said, "Oh, check that. That's Porcupine, another village." Anyway, so we finally did get in there. So when I got in there, this had gone on, with the waiting on the neighboring reservation and the Underground Railroad and this long trek in. It's been going on for quite a while. And so when I finally got in there, I thought, now what do you do? It was just impossible to get out photographs except with a runner who might get busted, and then that film would be gone. And they had one telephone at that time before the government cut that phone, and there were 40 people, it seemed like, at all times waiting to use that to call in and tell their families that they were okay or whatever they needed. So I did finally make one call to my radio station in St. Paul, maybe the most honest report I've ever made, because they were live, and the man's name was Marvin Granger, and he was a good anchor at that station. And he said to me, "So we have Kevin McKiernan on the line right now, and he's at the village of Wounded Knee. Kevin, what would you tell the listeners what's going on?" And I said, well, I don't really know what's going on. The Indians are saying that the feds are coming in tomorrow and using their armored vehicles and gas, and then the feds are saying, no, that's not true. We're not doing that. We just want to negotiate. So I said, I'm hearing two different sides, and I really don't know what's going on. So I think it was probably my most honest report, because a reporter's never supposed to not know, right? You have to know. And even if you don't know, you make something up and you say this or that. So that was the last time I was able to talk to my station. And then there were a couple of months before I came out of there. And when I came out in handcuffs. So, but it was the time in between that was so amazing for me, a stranger, you could say, in a strange land, who didn't know very much, and I found it to be a great education. And the film that I made that you mentioned, From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, some 40-some years of developments, was not the definitive story of Wounded Knee. It wasn't the Native point of view. It wasn't the government point of view. It wasn't even the press point of view. It's really just what I saw myself and kind of my education, and how lucky and honored I was to be welcomed into this community that was literally under fire, where people were being wounded and a couple of people were killed, and I became a fly on the wall, you might say. I was present for these historic negotiations where at one period of time, it amounted to about a week, the feds representing the White House and the Justice Department would helicopter in, and they would sit there in the round church or in a teepee, depending on what was going on at the time. And I got to sit there with my tape recorder a few feet away from them and watch something that they didn't want to have anyone watch. They were trying to choke off the oxygen of publicity. They thought that would kill. If you got the reporters out there, that would stop out of there. That would stop the occupation. And because the American Indian movement, in their eyes, only wanted publicity, and so take away the reporters, and then they'll quit. Of course, that they didn't understand what was really going on there. That for hundreds of people who were searching for their religion and their culture, this was more than 10 weeks of practicing those ceremonies and, to some extent, their language, while exchanging gunfire with hundreds of these federal agencies. So that was what was most surprising to me. We think of Wounded Knee as being an example of violence, and certainly there was an awful lot of shooting. President Nixon's Attorney General, Richard Kleindienst, after the long siege, testified that he estimated that 500,000 rounds had been fired into Wounded Knee. Bullets. And so at night we'd be at the hub, and we'd see tracers coming 360 degrees from all these angles from the armored positions of the feds in the hills. Wounded Knee was kind of in a saucer, and you could imagine the hills around it made it a good target. And so if you associate, and I think history in some ways does that this was a violent, militant, armed occupation. Well, I think that's true in one, as far as it goes. But for me, what I found out was that the center of the strength at Wounded Knee was a spiritual one, and that the ceremonies those were the things that people were really there for. That was their hunger, and that had been deprived. Their religion had been proscribed, outlawed. I mean, if you go back to the massacre in 1890, those victims were religious refugees who were killed for their religion, and they were practicing the ghost dance, which was against the law, and it was a nonviolent ritual, and so forth. So religion was a very big deal. And in fact, the first task after Wounded Knee was to get past the Indian Freedom of Religion Act. That was the first of many congressional acts that took place after Wounded Knee. And I think one of the most important things, because I've talked to people in our lifetimes who were secretly praying at a ceremony somewhere, and they had lookouts on the hills watching for the police cars, because what they were doing was against the law. And I mean, it's an extraordinary story that I was introduced to. You know, it's just beyond my ability to even capture. You know, that there were in the year 1500, thereabouts, there were some 18 million Indians in North America, and by 1900, there were only about 400,000 who were left. And so,
And you're listening to American Indian Airwaves. We're speaking with Kevin McKernan, director of the documentary From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, a reporter's journey about him as a rookie NPR reporter on his first assignment covering the armed occupation of Wounded Knee in South Dakota in 1973. And now back to the interview.
they were nearly exterminated. There was nearly the final solution. And I know that that the famous Nicholas Black Elk, who came and saw all those bodies on the ground the day after the 1890 massacre, he said, the tree of life is dead, and it will only, but he had another vision that it would be revived at some time. And so the medicine men who held these Herculean number of sweat lodge baths every day, Wallace Black Elk, his great-grandson, and Leonard Crow Dog, they were telling us in the sweat lodge that this was the prophecy of Nicholas Black Elk in 1890, that the tree of life would spring back, and it wasn't completely severed. And the medicine men would say to those inside the sweat lodge, you are the people who are reenacting this. You are bringing this back. You are doing what Nicholas Black Elk said in his prophecy, that it would come back.
And that concludes the first segment of our program here on American Indian Airwaves. We were speaking with Kevin McKernan, who's the director of the film From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, a reporter's journey. It's about his experiences as a rookie NPR reporter on his first assignment covering the armed occupation of Wounded Knee in South Dakota in 1973. The Wounded Knee occupation resulted in a 71-day military standoff between Indigenous peoples and government officials, and quickly drew international and domestic support from people, organizations, and foreign governments throughout the world. 2023 marks the 50th anniversary of the Wounded Knee occupation from February 27th to May 8th of 1973. You're listening to American Indian Airwaves. We're going to take a short break and come back with our interview with Kevin McKernan on From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, a reporter's journey.
Indian legislation's on the desk of a do-right congressman. Now he don't know much about the issue, so he picks up the phone and he asks advice of the senators out in Indian country, darlings of the energy companies who are ripping off what's left of the reservations. I learned a safety rule. I don't know who to thank. Don't stand between the reservations and the corporate banks. They send in federal tanks. It isn't nice, but it's reality. Bury my heart at Wounded Knee. Bury my heart at Wounded Knee. Deep in the earth. Bury my heart at Wounded Knee. Cover me with pretty lies. Bury my heart at Wounded Knee. Bury my heart at Wounded Knee. Bury my heart at Wounded Knee. We got these energy companies
Buffy St. Marie, the song Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, here on American Indian Airwaves. In the final segment of today's program, here on American Indian Airwaves, executive producer Marcus Lopez and myself continue our interview with Kevin McKernan, director of the documentary From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, A Reporter's Journey. The film is about himself as a rookie NPR reporter on his first assignment covering the occupation of Wounded Knee in South Dakota in 1973. The Wounded Knee occupation resulted in a 71-day military standoff between members of the American Indian movement and Indigenous peoples and government officials, which quickly drew domestic and international support from people, organizations, and foreign governments throughout the world. 2023 marks the 50th anniversary of the occupation of Wounded Knee. And now back to our interview with Kevin McKernan, director of the documentary From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, A Reporter's Journey.
Kevin, back at Wounded Knee during the, like what you said, 10 weeks of the takeover or the reasserting their own responsibilities of Lakota people, how many, you found out later on, how many federal, state, local, and even the FBI and these different agencies were there to kind of give the public a flavor of it wasn't just a bunch of Indians against a police force, but it was really a military assault. Could you kind of unwrap that for us and for our listeners?
It was definitely a military assault. You would see armored personnel carriers, the very ones that were at work in Vietnam at the same time. They were encircling the village, and they had very heavily fortified bunkers. But the weaponry, the automatic weaponry, the machine guns, it was something that sometimes I would think that I was watching an old John Wayne movie or something, because I'd never seen anything like this. And here it was in a place that was so distant from anywhere else, in a rural area, and these gunshots were only heard really by us and by them. And I think that was a big difference, that the people in Wounded Knee had very small, hunting rifles, 22s, shotguns, and this sort of stuff. And at one point, the government sent F-4s, the fighter jets that were at work in Vietnam, buzzed the village at 500 feet just to scare people and to say, this is what's going to happen to you, just the way it's happened in Vietnam and in other countries. You can see those jets in my film From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock. So,
Kevin, I wanted Larry to weigh in on this, but Wounded Knee just did not start just because people felt that way, but there was activity within the reservations, specifically Pine Ridge, and afterwards about what was happening. What did you find out? What the perimeter, what people's life was then? I remember that, but I wanted you to tell what you found out about the reservation life. Like you mentioned a little bit about commodity food and lifestyle, but yet there was a lot of violence in the reservations. Could you unpack that for us a little bit, if you care to?
Sure. The organization that was fighting nonviolently against the tribal administration, which had a great amount of corruption, was called the Oglala Sioux Civil Rights Organization. And those letters, the acronym for Oglala Sioux Civil Rights Organization was OSCRO. So OSCRO staged weeks of protest against the administration for outlawing activities, for arresting protesters, for firing people from their much-needed tribal jobs. for going after political opponents and settling scores and so on. And the tribal chairman, Dick Wilson, had his private police force, which he called his auxiliary police, that were reportedly paid with federal anti-poverty funds. And this group was called the Goons, and they were proud of the term because they called it themselves the Guardians of the Lakota Nation. And my movie opens with my introducing myself at an illegal roadblock where court-ordered food and medicine and baby supplies and all that were ordered in by the federal court. And this group of goons and Dick Wilson, the tribal chairman leading them, stopped and I filmed that they're taking away the food at gunpoint to go in. So there were a lot of unhappy people who didn't like the way the reservation was being run. And for every $100 that came from Washington supposedly to better the life on the reservation, maybe a couple of dollars, or certainly fewer than $5, actually ended up there. And Dick Wilson had a construction company, and that was a no-bid building that took place on the reservation, and his company got all of that. So at one point, these nonviolent demonstrators, civil rights demonstrators, tried to impeach him through the impeachment system, but he ended up presiding over his own impeachment, and of course he wasn't impeached. So at that point, OSCRO, the Oglala Sioux Civil Rights Organization, invited the American Indian movement to come in. And the American Indian movement had been active in the area already because of the killing of Indians in border towns to the reservation. And so they decided then to, on February 27th, 1973, they led a caravan of cars and had made announcements within their group designed to fool the informers, who were many and were reporting to the feds, that they were going to a powwow in the next town beyond Wounded Knee.
And you're listening to American Indian Airwaves. We're speaking with Kevin McKernan, director of the documentary From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, a reporter's journey about him as a rookie NPR reporter on his first assignment covering the armed occupation of Wounded Knee in South Dakota in 1973. And now back to the interview.
So that the headlight stretched for a couple of miles, and of course they turned off at Wounded Knee, and that's where the takeover began. So yes, there was a buildup. There was a lot of, the worst part of the goon violence against Indians came after Wounded Knee, when the goons had been sidelined because of all the publicity about AIM, their archenemy. And so it was payback time, and there was a reign of terror where there were dozens and dozens of killings, murders of traditionalists and of people adjudged to be pro-AIM, pro-American Indian movement. And in many cases, according to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, the FBI looked the other way or did not do its job in fairly enforcing the law. And so most of these cases were never solved, and I do a scroll in the film of some of the people who were killed, including a young man I knew named Byron DeSursa, who was shot to death in broad daylight at the wheel of his car and bled to death outside the village of Wanblee. I covered that. That was one of my NPR reports. I started out working for a station called KSJN in St. Paul, and then I did a lot of reporting for NPR in the 3 years after Wounded Knee, when I actually became a reporter and wasn't just learning how to be one.
Yeah, you're so right, Kevin. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights has formally concluded that the FBI and its goon surrogate rather than aim, were fostering a reign of terror on Pine Ridge. So afterwards, even the activity where a lot of the children and women were not only the men but assaulted, and it created havoc, literally havoc, on not only Pine Ridge but the rest of it. So what you were saying, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which is not a radical organization, but they concluded that. And Larry, I know you had a question for Kevin.
Yeah, I did. Thank you, Marcus. Kevin, when I'm listening to you talking about your lived experiences and what happened at the time, I was wondering if how much of what has been happening in the recent years were part of your experiences while you were there. So I'm thinking of, the occupation of Alcatraz from 69, to 71, the Trail of Broken Treaties, the occupation of the BIA office, and also the 20-point position paper that Native American activist Hank Adams helped draft, and who was also a participant of the Trail of Broken Treaties. And this was drafted before, right, the quote unquote, the occupation of Wounded Knee. So I was wondering if you could, how much of that was part of the conversation is part of the occupation of Wounded Knee?
Well, Hank Adams, really one of my heroes, was a key negotiator at Wounded Knee, who sat in on all the negotiations between the traditionalists and the American Indian movement and the feds. The White House representative, Kent Frizzell, and the Department of Justice representative, Richard Hellstern. And he was an encyclopedia of information. He had been involved in the fishing rights cases in the 1960s, and rose to some prominence there, at least within Indian country. And he was a very smart, very reasonable, very cool man, and always soft-spoken and always carrying a heavy information. And so, he did those 20 points. He was very much involved in the Trail of Broken Treaties, which was only 3 months before the takeover of Wounded Knee. It was during election week in 1972. So there was this buildup that was going on, and really the climax of that was at Wounded Knee. And it started, of course, as you mentioned, in Alcatraz in 1969, and had gone over in Minneapolis, the city I was living in. There had been the takeover of the Naval Air Station there. You'll have to remember that AIM was founded in 1968, so within those 5 years, things escalated pretty fast. There was the first thing that the American Indian movement did, which catapulted them to national attention, was to create the AIM Patrol. These were old jalopies that were painted with house paint on the side, the words AIM Patrol, and they faced off with police. And the police were famous and notorious in Minneapolis for knocking heads and for showing up at bar time, at closing time in bars, and tremendous violence against Indian people. And I know that one interview I did, I think this interview is in the film too, with AIM co-founder Dennis Banks. He said there were 2 reasons that AIM was acting. AIM began in response to poverty and police brutality, those 2 things. And the police brutality was really considerable. AIM co-founder Clyde Bellecourt, told me that when he was arrested for having his high beams on in an alley by 3 police cars, you get some idea of what was going on, and that got the criticism of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. It wasn't just, radicals saying this is unfair. And Clyde told me about that encounter, that when he saw them, when they put him in the police car, he had to leave his car in the alley, and they started putting on gloves. He knew what was coming next. And back to Dennis Banks again, Dennis told me, and this interview is in the film From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, he said, AIM was started by people who had fallen in the gutter and they couldn't get up, but they wanted to do something. And so these marches that took place after the Trail of Broken Treaties, the murder of Raymond Yellow Thunder in Gordon, Nebraska, killings in the Black Hills, and it just accelerated to the point where Wounded Knee was taken over. And
Kevin, the living that time and looking at all the different aspects of it, AIM was just galvanized by all the. You talked about that, which it was interesting what that elder said about how was AIM in 1920s. Now, it didn't exist then, but the settlement and the reaction of Native people by the way this country was established, and you implied that, but for the elimination of the first people of indigenous populations and their different respective nations, and the expropriation of the land, which the 13 colonies started, and Larry and I always have discussions about this, but started with, and this is the only really nation state, but actually eliminated its people to get their land. And then within that, just like Elder says, since the treaties, whether it be Fort Laramie or Ruby Valley or the Home Treaty or whatever treaties and agreements, the federal government has never recognized nor honored those treaties, number one. But secondly, I wanted your comment when you heard this elder says, I'm in AIM since 1920s or thereabouts. What went through your mind?
Well, I've just come from the 50th anniversary of the Wounded Knee siege, and of course I never thought I would live this long. But in the days that I spent out there in the last week were extraordinarily emotional for me. So many people I knew then have passed on in these 50 years and were not there, but their children were, and the legacy was there. And to have my film shown, and I'm getting the Reservation Theater texted me yesterday, and they said that they had 227 high school students come to the theater to watch that film. And that was, there for me was the success and the legacy. People are hungry for their history, not just Native people, but everyone, because in many ways we've all lost our history and we keep reinventing the wheel. And here they continue the practice there, and they passed it down to their children. And this, I think, this resistance continues to live on. And I think today the biggest beneficiary of that is there's some 500 reservations, and on every one of those reservations there's a land back movement where people are going to buy back, get back, litigate back, be given back.
The moment of silence is over.
And that was Kevin McKernan, director of the film From Wounded Knee to Standing Rock, a reporter's journey about his life experiences as a rookie NPR reporter covering the occupation of Wounded Knee of 1973. 2023 marks the 50th anniversary of the occupation of Wounded Knee. Tune in next week for part 2 of our interview with Kevin McKernan. That concludes our show for today here on American Indian Airwaves. A special thank you to our guest, Kevin McKernan. A special thank you to our musical guests, Aragon Starr, Koopa Aina, Buffy St. Marie, and the band Blackfire. American Indian Airwaves is mixed and mastered in the studios of Burnt Swamp Studios in Signal Hill, California. For Marcus Lopez, I've been your host for the hour, Larry Smith. Until next time.
And for the innocent, you can't justify why your freedom manifests on their graves. And the blood never comes clean from the guilty minds, nor the hands that hold the chains. In a rhythm of resistance, we still fight for our lives. In this war that never ended, we've outgrown your lives. Let our actions speak when they ignore our words. For all the lives, there's a truth that must be heard. After all the lies and the empty promises, we take a stand on the land that you tried to bury us. For all the pain and all the suffering, we take a stand. We take a stand. We sleep caged against our fears, try not to become what we've endured, wearing our souls on the thread.